With me today I have Dr. Christina Lee, who is the Associate Professor in Viking Studies in the School of English. Christina, welcome.
Hello, Tom.
One of the interesting things about people who are involved in medieval studies is that they realise that religion is terribly important. Why is religion so important in medieval studies?
It underpins a culture. We cannot think about the Middle Ages without thinking about religion. In the medieval period, particularly in my period, I'm an early medievalist, we see a dramatic change. The conversion to Christianity did not just change belief, it also changed the culture. It introduced a number of feast days. It tapped into some existing feast days, of course, we know that. But it also introduced ideas about how people should live. Just a very small thing, which may not be so small, is it's the arrival of literacy. It's not that people didn't have stories before the advent of Christianity, but Christianity is a religion of the book, and it emphasized the need of the written word. And while we have religious texts to start with, it also in its trail brings with it literature. So for me, for someone who's in the School of English, all of our wonderful Anglo-Saxon poems are a result of a sea change, of writing things down, of taking an oral tradition and putting it onto paper. The other thing that is important to remember is that it may not be, people always imagine medieval people to be, completely besotted with religion, stuff to be quite blinkered. It's not that. It's a pragmatic religion. It's a pragmatic attitude towards religion. But religion brings with it also some really interesting and good aspects. So, for example, the idea of healthcare. We have the emphasis on Christ being a healer in the New Testament, and this is emulated by people in the church, people saying, we do need to give some care to people. We have, hospitals associated, or at least infirmaries associated with most of the monasteries in the Anglo-Saxon period. These are not places where you necessarily will be cured, but these are places where you will be made comfortable, and also when you're old and have no one to look after you, where someone will look after you. So it brings with it a number of changes and a number of innovations. The other thing why religion is important is also because the poetry often reflects on who am I? What is my place in this world? Why am I here? Why do I have to suffer? And it responds, and it shouldn't surprise us because these centres of writing things down were monastic institutions. It often responds to it by answering with, because there is a God and there are things you go through. It is a dialogue with classical antiquity. When we see the Christianization of the Roman Empire, it is a dialogue with the past, but also a dialogue with the present.
And of course, when you mention Anglo-Saxon poetry, when you turn to Bede and you find the lovely story of Cadman.
Absolutely. Here we have a creation poem that Bede associates with being the first poem ever in England, but it comes. The story goes like this. There is this cowherd, Cadman, who lives in the monastery of Whitby, and he loves listening to stories, but he's very, very shy. So every time his turn comes around, he hides on the beam of the upper story. Tells us that Anglo-Saxons had two-story houses as well. So he is very shy, but one night he has a dream. And of course, we know this idea that, you get a dream. We have Constantine, who dreams, of being victorious in the sign of the cross. But Cadman has a dream about poetry. And he dreams a poem that has a number of names for God and the creation. Nu shall on Herian heaven riches word, now we heavenly guardian. And it is a wonderful poem. Bede is a very interesting narrator that tells us about poetry being an important aspect of communities.
And of course, Cadman in the Historia Ecclesiastica is portrayed as the innocent, simple Christian singing the song of the creation, just as Bede does when he writes his commentary on Genesis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's an amazing story, and it's also this idea of gaining this particular knowledge, and that this knowledge comes to you, and that it is divinely inspired, but also something that comes from within.
There's another aspect of, and that is that religion creates a different space around people. Yes. Like, for instance, isn't it true that we're able to track the arrival of Christianity in different parts of Anglo-Saxon England by looking at the alignment of the graves? Because when...
Yes, there is a change in the orientation of graves. So in early Anglo-Saxon society, in the pagan society, there are a number of options on how you can bury your dead. We do see an alignment of east-west. It's not always like this. We do see graves later on. What I need to stress here is people often say it's pagan when there's grave goods, it's Christian when there are none. That is a bit of a red herring, because grave goods continued, particularly in ecclesiastical graves. You still have bishops being, interred with their office insignia, the patens, later on. And even Bede tells us, that St. Cuthbert was buried in his best shoes so that he could run towards Christ.
A lovely story.
It's a lovely story. So we need to kind of be very careful. But what does change is the idea of burial space. It gradually changes. You have to understand that Christianization is something that doesn't happen overnight. You can take the faith, but if you have no church, no priest to emphasize this, then it's a little bit hollow. So it takes some time for the conversion to settle in. And it will have been a backward-forward process. The church will have also made some concessions, stuff to appeal to the English. They had to do this. And only when we have established churches we can have the idea of hallowed ground. So that comes in towards the latter Anglo-Saxon period, that people expect to be in a burial space that is hallowed. And here we can see some really interesting phenomena. We can see people always think about medieval society as excluding, but we see the inclusion of babies, for example, of people with impairments in this very special place, which shows, if there is a care for the soul, an idea, so that these people perhaps need a little bit more help. A baby that, particularly if it is unbaptized or very small, may need to be, closer to the altar, or that these people are special, that they are seen as something that deserves a place in this space.
The other interesting aspect of this is that you mentioned how the monasteries, their place, they're interested in healing, but of course there's another aspect, and that is the interest in the church's peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers, because, for instance, one sees that very clearly in a situation that comes from the same time as Bede, but the Synod of Birr in Ireland, where there's the Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocents, whereby you try to take children and women out of the warfare situation, and you're trying to mitigate the warfare that is endemic in a tribal society. And that is another aspect of where we see the development of the polity being a reflection of the place of religion in the society.
Yes. Although I do think, that for those who are in power, religion is no impediment for war, and quite often used as a badge of righteousness. As you said, I am, largely studying Vikings, and there is a clear idea of them and us, and of the Christian South identifying themselves as, the righteous people. But of course, we also get ideas of wrong religion, which is really interesting. The idea that God sends plagues, Vikings, to punish those who have fallen from grace, which we get later on.
And of course, that's a theme that goes right back into Christian theology. In the earliest British theologian, I'm stressing the Britishness rather than the Englishness, Gildas.
Yes.
Gildas, of course, sees the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons precisely because they were such bad people that the British have to be punished.
Indeed. And Gildas is really interesting because Gildas is picked up by several Anglo-Saxon writers. And they kind of talk about the English then being punished by pagans in the same way as Gildas, because of course, you know, the British were Christian and the arriving Anglo-Saxons were pagan, just kind of says, well, this happens because you are bad Christians. So we get this again when the Vikings arrive, that people just say, you know, well, you know, if you're not good Christians, so you get Vikings. And we get that time and again. So that is repeated. It's a fascinating idea. And of course, the idea that you might have priests with you who might carry a little bit of favor with God because, you know, they are very ascetic, they can do particular hymns. We're getting that in Bede as well. You know, we're getting this idea that these people have more effective priests than us, which is striking.
Yeah. Christina, thank you very much for introducing this fascinating and vast area. Thank you.
Thank you very much.